The essence of this case is actually quite simple. The state just walked you through for quite some time about the evidence and how it thinks it's going to come through during this trial. But at the end of the day, law enforcement nor the state have no idea what happened to Mr. Gutierrez's body. They don't know when exactly anything happened in Mr. Gutierrez's apartment. They have no idea where any alleged remains of Mr. Gutierrez's body is. They have none of that. There are no witnesses that saw my client, Mr. Zachariah Anderson, at 3709 15th Avenue in Kenosha on May 17th, 2020. They have absolutely no witnesses that say, hey, we saw Mr. Anderson and he had bloody clothes or he was acting suspicious. They have none of that because none of that evidence exists. No body, no human remains, no indication of cleaning up a crime scene despite what they state occurred in that van. I'll talk to you a little about that later. They don't have any of that. Yet they decided to build a script, and the evidence will show you this. They decided to build a script and tell a story and make Mr. Anderson the main character, despite the fact that they didn't have any of this evidence. No body, no human remains, no witnesses, nothing. If you're looking in the wrong places and at the wrong people, you are not going to find the information you're looking for. The state just talked to you at length about some of the evidence that it believes is going to come in, and that evidence is going to show you that Mr. Anderson committed the crimes as charged. And the state and myself, he explained to you kind of what opening statements are. I'm not going to do that. You're all capable people of understanding why we're speaking to you right now. But I'm speaking because I see the evidence a little bit differently. And when I'm walking you through the evidence that will come in today, it's not based on speculation. It's not based on some theories that are in my head where there's no evidence to back that up. I'm going to walk you through the actual evidence that will come through during this trial. But let's start with what the state kind of walked you through. That this really all stems because Mr. Anderson is a crazy, jealous, obsessive ex. The evidence during this trial will debunk that theory. And in addition to that issue, motive is not an element of the crime. In order to be threatened by a serious relationship has to exist. The state talked about how things were getting heavy between Mr. Gutierrez and Ms. Beecham, that they were meeting each other's kids, that there was talk about that. What the state didn't inform you was that Mr. Gutierrez was actively dating and seeing several other women. He was not in any means exclusive with Ms. Beecham. He had in fact told some of his closest friends that he was intending on breaking up with Ms. Beecham. Ms. Beecham had never met a single one of Mr. Gutierrez's friends. And this concept of that the state talked about how, she had never talked to her child about Mr. Gutierrez, or that information must have come from Mr. Anderson. That's not accurate. And the text messages that will come in will establish that Ms. Beecham had discussed Mr. Gutierrez with her daughter. There were text messages that she sent to Mr. Gutierrez that says, "Liv wants to meet your kids before she meets you." Well, obviously, she must have had a conversation with her daughter about who Mr. Gutierrez was. but still doesn't change the underlying factor that this was not a serious relationship. Additionally, from February of 2020 through May of 2020, there was consistent communication between Mr. Anderson and Miss Beecham. And that communication wasn't, oh, I want you so bad, come back with me. It was kind of a mutual agreement that their relationship was toxic. They were never getting back together, that she had guys she was seeing, and Mr. Anderson had his own girlfriend. The timeline. The state said that the timeline shows Mr. Anderson must have been involved, but the state's ignoring critical evidence as to that timeline. The state admitted May 17th, 2020, Mr. Anderson had his kids, his 3 children. They were at his home in Mequon, Wisconsin. That later in that afternoon, around 5 to 6, Miss Beecham picks them up. Mr. Anderson then, they don't have any evidence that Mr. Anderson left his home. They claim that this is the time where he traveled down to Kenosha, but you'll hear from law enforcement officers that they got surveillance video from multiple places, not only in the Mequon, Ozaukee County area that Mr. Anderson would have had to pass to get to Mr. Gutierrez's apartment, but they also got surveillance from gas stations, schools, the transit authority, from the buses, from neighbors' ring cameras, from the area in Kenosha that Mr. Anderson would have had to have passed if he was driving. And you'll hear from law enforcement that they don't observe Mr. Anderson's vehicle. So the state has absolutely, there will be no evidence during this trial that will be presented to you that shows that on May 17th, 2020, when Sadie Beecham is at Mr. Anderson's home, she sees him there. He then texts someone at 11:19 p.m., and you'll hear from law enforcement officers that his phone pings at his home at 11:19 p.m. Nothing shows he ever left home that night. People falling asleep around 7 to 8 p.m. as adults who have children and have been with them all day, that's not unreasonable. So the next morning, he wakes up, he goes to Walmart. You'll hear evidence that Mr. Anderson's a contractor. He was going to a home up in Cedar Grove area that he was working on. He was doing lath removal and other serious removal jobs. It was basically a complete reconstruction of the property. And so if he went to Walmart and parked far away, you'll hear evidence that he likely had tools in his van. And in addition to that, he then goes to his job site for 3 hours. And the state's saying that after that, they don't know where he goes. No idea. The evidence will establish that after he was at the house in Cedar Grove for 3 hours, he went to Menominee Falls to pick up his taxes. That's a nice fact that the state didn't talk about that will come in. And what's interesting about the fact that Mr. Anderson had gone and picked up his taxes in Menominee Falls right after working at his job site in the morning is that that evidence wasn't readily given to the defense. That you'll hear that this evidence, this receipt that's dated 5/18/2020 from the tax accountant services was a piece of paper that was located in Mr. Anderson's van. And that law enforcement, when they executed the search on Mr. Anderson's property, they took all the papers and put them in a pile and labeled them miscellaneous papers. And they took one picture of all of those papers and put that into discovery, and that picture's blurry. You'll see that picture. It wasn't until the defense asked to see that documentation that we saw this receipt that proved that Mr. Anderson wasn't, for hours, getting rid of a body, but was going to pick up his taxes in Menominee Falls. And you'll hear from the accountants that he was there. You'll also hear from them that they had video surveillance, that law enforcement, had they gone and talked to these people would have been able to get that surveillance video to see what Mr. Anderson was wearing, the fact that he didn't have any blood on his clothes. And then after he picks up his taxes, he goes back home and spends the night with his girlfriend, Christine Remsburg. The next morning, they wake up. It's a normal day. But it's not normal for Mr. Anderson because two random people show up on his property demanding that they speak with a person named Zachariah Anderson, and Mr. Anderson knows that he doesn't know these people. They don't know what he looks like, so he says, hey, I'm his brother. He's not here right now. What do you want? And they say, as the state noted, we're looking for our missing friend from Kenosha. And these people are snooping around his property, acting suspicious. And so what does Mr. Anderson do? He calls 911 himself and says, hey, there's these two random people that are on my property demanding to speak with me. I told them that I'm my brother because I'm a little concerned about why they're here, and they're demanding questions about their missing friend from Kenosha. The man who the state's alleging had something to do with the disappearance of Mr. Gutierrez is calling 911 and saying they're saying that I had something to do with this missing guy from Kenosha. Law enforcement responds to the home, but it's not to respond to Mr. Anderson's concerns. They're there to arrest Mr. Anderson and to execute a search warrant on his property. He's taken into custody. They take pictures of what he's wearing: white t-shirt, blue jeans. They send some of those, say, oh, there looks to appear to be a stain on this shirt. Let's swab it and send it to the crime lab, not blood. No DNA of Mr. Gutierrez. Oh, the jeans, looks like there's another red dot. Let's swab it and send it to the crime lab. No blood, no DNA linking back to Rosalio Gutierrez. They took pictures, you'll see these, of Mr. Anderson's hands, feet, arms, not a single scratch, not a single bruise, nothing. So the state's assertion that there's going to be evidence that Mr. Anderson had time to get rid of every single possible piece of evidence, the body, all remains, everything that he used to clean up. The state talked about some items bought at Walmart. They were 13-gallon trash bags and 2 things of Clorox wipes. Don't think that's enough to meticulously clean up a crime scene, nor is there any evidence that that is. Additionally, as you'll hear, this was during the height of COVID. It was basically still almost about to be the lockdown, or actually was in the middle of the lockdown. So searching to see what stores are open before you go to a job site was not bizarre. You'll also hear that during COVID, items such as Clorox wipes and gloves were extremely hard to come by, and you would pick them up when you got the opportunity. So the timeline that the state told you, there's evidence that supplements that shows Mr. Anderson could not have had the opportunity to commit the charged offense. The other piece of evidence that the state talked about was Marquand Washington, and that Mr. Anderson allegedly admitted to him that he did this and that he stabbed Mr. Gutierrez, took his body, put it in some trash bags, and took the trash out and got rid of him forever. The state talked to you a little bit about Marquand Washington. Marquand Washington is currently facing a minimum of 10 years to life, and it's a federal case. And you'll hear during this trial that in federal cases, when there are mandatory minimums, the only way to deviate from that mandatory minimum, so the only way to get less than 10 years is if you cooperate. If you provide information and then get on the stand and testify to that and cooperate that the government, who's the prosecutor in a federal case, can file a document to say, Judge, we're asking for lesser than that 10-year mandatory minimum. And you'll see that in Mr. Washington's plea paperwork, the government nicely outlines that in order for you to get less time, this is what you're going to have to do. Now, the state didn't mention this to you, but Mr. Washington is someone who will literally do anything to get out of his situation. That they had evidence, that the federal government had evidence that he intimidated the witnesses and victims in his own case in an attempt to get out of his situation. And when that didn't work, he was left with one option: cooperation. And in February of 2022, the federal government was told that he had information that he wanted to share, and they wrote a letter to him, and they said, Mr. Washington, we've heard that you want to share some information about some crimes that you have knowledge about in the Milwaukee surrounding area. Please let us know what that is. He did not mention Mr. Anderson in February of 2022, and that's critical because the state said that Mr. Anderson trusts Marquand Washington, but Marquand Washington only was housed with Mr. Anderson for approximately 3 weeks. It was a very short housing situation. And those 3 weeks was from December of 2021 to February of 2022. Or no, sorry, I apologize. It was December of 2021 to January 31st of 2022. So in February of 22, he would have had this information. But he didn't share it then. No, he only shared it about 3 weeks ago in a case that's been going on since May of 2020, when he's allegedly had this information for almost 2 years. But what's even more critical is Marquand Washington, as the state says he will testify, and I'm saying as the state will say he will testify because the defense did not have the opportunity to meet with Mr. Washington. Mr. Gravely, the district attorney, and Vincent Carrera, a detective, they met with Marquand Washington. And they questioned him for an hour and 30 minutes approximately. They did not record the interview. Instead, they gave the defense a 2.5-page summary of what he would say. But what I do know from that 2.5-page summary is that he claims that Mr. Anderson said he stabbed the guy. The state talked about how you'll hear from officers about the blood stain pattern analysis completed in this case. That officer will tell you that he believed that the stain patterns that were seen in Mr. Gutierrez's apartment were consistent with blunt force trauma. That was his opinion just in February of last year, Officer Van Wee, and in his reports from closer to May 2020, he wrote that he believed it was blunt force trauma, so a heavy object or an object hitting someone. And also Detective Carrera wrote in his reports that it was blunt force trauma. There was never a single mention in Van Wee's reports or Detective Carrera's reports that the stain pattern analysis were consistent with sharp force injuries. There's a difference between blunt force injuries and sharp force injuries. Sharp force injuries is a knife. No mention of that. In fact, you'll hear that Mr. Gutierrez was an avid baseball fan, loved baseball. Not only did he love baseball, but he loved to play baseball with his kids. And he was a coach for minor leagues. And so he had baseballs in his apartment and in his truck. He had gloves in his apartment and in his truck. You know what wasn't recovered in the crime scene? Or in a truck? Not a single baseball bat. Not a single one. But the state told you that they had a shard of, the state said it themselves, what could have come off of a baseball bat with blood on it. So the evidence will contradict itself It can't be the stabbing, and it can't be the baseball bat. The next item that the state talked about was the DNA in the van, and the state claims that there will be a witness that will get up here and tell you that that was blood in that van. And I'm not sure where that's coming from. Because Lisa Treffinger, who's an analyst at the state crime lab, was the individual in charge of processing the van and that particular dot. And it was so small, like freckle size. She's the individual responsible. And you'll hear from her and other state crime lab analysts that they processed that van extremely thoroughly. You'll see pictures of the van too. Not a van that's been cleaned. There's dirt everywhere, dust on the dashboard, no indication that it's been cleaned, no blood in the front driver's seat. In fact, no blood anywhere. They saw red dots, tested it for blood. They did a test that's specific to determine if a item that purports to look like blood is blood, negative. They did luminol testing. I don't know if any of you are aware of that, but what they do is they spray this substance and it will basically light up if there's the presence of blood. Didn't light up. They said that there was this one flicker of light, so they tested that area, negative for blood. This dot that the state claims someone's going to tell you was blood, in an email from Lisa Treffinger, the analyst that will testify, you'll hear her tell you that the state asked her, an email from the state, I just wanted to confirm that the sample that was sourced to Rosalio from the van was blood, right? This was analyst Treffinger's response, and she'll testify to this. We could not confirm it was blood. Her own words, not mine. DNA in his van, though. How do you explain that? The state claims that the explanation of how Mr. Gutierrez's blood got in the van was because Mr. Anderson must have killed him. But the evidence will tell you that there's a far more logical explanation for how that occurred. The state talked to you about the evidence that might come in about an incident that happened on April 24th, 2020, where Mr. Anderson had gone into Mr. Gutierrez's vehicle, had taken something out. This was talked about between Ms. Beecham and Mr. Gutierrez at length. Ms. Beecham told Mr. Gutierrez on April 25th about what had happened, how Mr. Anderson had gone in his car. And they talked about how maybe something should be done about that. There was conversations between them about how maybe Mr. Anderson should get a taste of his own medicine. Later that night, at 11:10 p.m. on April 25th, 2020, Ms. Beecham received a text from Mr. Gutierrez that said, "What's his fucking address?" Sadie responded, "Well, I guess if he has your info, you should have his." And then Mr. Gutierrez sends her a text with Mr. Anderson's address. This is on the 25th. And then on the 26th, he sends her a text that says, "For the record, only if you say it's okay." He also sent, and then Ms. Beecham sends him a text, "He's gonna find out." This all happens on the 26th of April. Mr. Gutierrez is apprised of the fact that Mr. Anderson went into his vehicle. Sadie and Mr. Gutierrez talk about how something should be done similar to Mr. Anderson. And then On April 26th, 2020, Mr. Gutierrez's Cellbrite location data puts him at 6813 Highland Road, Mequon, Wisconsin. He's there. Mr. Gutierrez, after talking about how something similar should be done to Mr. Anderson, that something similar being going into a vehicle, is at Mr. Anderson's house. His location puts him there. And then right after he's there, he has a video FaceTime with Miss Beecham for 2.5 hours. And that conversation occurs at 3:11 a.m. in the morning. In addition to the fact that there's more reasonable explanations, as you'll see through the evidence, that is ignored by the prosecution, the fact that the timeline illustrates Mr. Anderson could not have done this, the fact that no one puts him there on May 17th, 2020, the fact that there is no blood in the van, there's no body, there are no remains, there's no murder weapon. They still are going with the fact that Mr. Anderson committed this crime. That's because, remember, that's who they chose as their main character. They ignored, and by they I mean law enforcement, ignored legitimate leads and follow-ups, suspicious people. And they ignored that because on May 19th, 2020, when law enforcement met with Sadie outside of Mr. Gutierrez's apartment, she said, "My ex had something to do with it." And they said, "Great, let's run with it. We're going to try to build a case around him, even if we don't have a body. We have no explanation of what happened to him. We have no explanation of where Mr. Anderson would have put a body. We're going to run with him." So what did they ignore? They ignored Miss Beecham. Miss Beecham, as the state noted, went to Mr. Gutierrez's residence at around 11 a.m. on Monday, May 19th, 2020. She had only been dating this guy for a couple months. This guy was dating other people. They only saw each other every other weekend, some weekends. It wasn't a hot and heavy relationship like the state wants it to purport. The evidence isn't going to show that. So she's only been dating this guy for a couple months, a guy she met off of Facebook dating, and decides, you know what, I haven't heard from him. I'm going to go to his house in the middle of the day when he would be working to see what's up. Sure, there could be innocent explanations to that, but you'll also hear evidence that Miss Beecham had constantly been texting with her best friend, Rebecca Jekyll, about how she thinks Zach's tracking her but can't prove anything. She says that. She says that to Rebecca Jekyll, and she's complaining about it. And this is all on 5/14/2020. She's complaining about it, text messages between her and her best friend, Rebecca Jekyll. And on May 14th, 2020, Rebecca Jekyll randomly texts Sadie Beecham and says, in this discussion string where they're discussing how she, is so irritated with Mr. Anderson, Miss Jekyll sends a random out-of-place text that says, "Phone call has been placed. All I was told is it will begin and you will not know when, where, or how. Call me in 1 week." And what's 1 week later? When she's at Mr. Gutierrez's apartment.